we're very, very quick when we look at the New Testament to see that Paul, when he writes his letters, is very occasional, right? When he writes to Corinth, we know there's trouble in Corinth and he's trying to address it, right? Bible students. But then when we turn over to other parts of the New Testament, we forget that. And we think that the Gospel of Matthew, which is where we're going to go, is sort of this disembodied document that tells us all we are supposed to know about Jesus. Well, that's not why Matthew wrote Matthew. Matthew is a ministerial leader, a pastor, a teacher, a shepherd elder, some sort of leader, whatever term you want to use, who's got a congregation of people that he's trying to shape and form. And I don't have time this morning to fully articulate why that's the case or how that's the case or to demonstrate that, but I'm hoping you'll trust me a little bit with that. But I'll try to point out a couple of things to show you the kind of cleverness and insight and wisdom that Matthew is using. I'm assuming that Matthew is a minister or a leader in a church or communities of churches in the late first century in a place called Antioch of Syria. You've probably never heard of either of those places. That's supposed to be a joke. It was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, 150,000 people living in 2 square miles. It was more dense population there than New York City. People living in squalid conditions. You can imagine that many people living in little apartment buildings with no plumbing or electricity. This is a very, very densely populated kind of environment. There are people living there from all over the world, refugees from all over the world, including Jerusalem and Jewish Christians. And Matthew's got a congregation there of people from all over the place who are doubly a minority. They're minorities because they're ethnic minorities. They're minorities because they're Christian. Double marginality is what some scholars call it. And Matthew is trying to find a way to hold that church and allow that church to flourish with all of that diversity and all that craziness. The diversity of it shows up right from the very get-go in the Gospel of Matthew. Have you ever, when you read the Gospel of Matthew, come on, admit it, do you skip the genealogy? Right? You just go straight to the birth of Jesus? Well, slow down sometime and read that. It's a brilliant act, pastoral act. He writes to talk about the reality of Jesus, and he uses a very Jewish way of doing this to help his Jewish Christians get with the program. And he uses a genre we call genealogy, right? Because Jews know genealogy. But he's got other people in that church too. So what does he do? He messes with the genre. Have you ever read the genealogy and noticed by chance that they're not all men in that genealogy? That's a big faux pas if you're writing for Jewish folk. You're supposed to talk about the men folk, not the women folk. But he uses 4 women in that narrative, in that genealogy. And all 4 of those women are non-Jews. Rahab and Tamar. And then he's all bashful about, he doesn't even say Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Right? What's he doing? He's signaling to his congregation that you are a part of this story. You're a part of it. This story about Jesus includes you too. Even if you're not a Jew, you're a part of it. He does it again in chapter 2 after we have the birth narrative, which I need to say something about in a moment. He gives 2 king stories. There's the Jewish king whose name is Herod, and then there's the non-Jewish king type folk who we call the Magi. And guess what kings come out better looking in that story, right? It's not the Jewish king. No, it's the mysterious minority folk that come out as the heroes in that story. He's contrasting and drawing everybody in. This Matthew guy is up to something. We're told the name of Jesus. His name is Jesus because he's going to save his people from their sins. And then Matthew adds another name for Jesus, Emmanuel, which means what, folk? God is with us. you ever noticed how that's in the beginning, and then what's at the end? What's at the very end of the Gospel of Matthew? What does Jesus say? And lo, I will be with you always. Matthew is embedding at the front and at the end the heartbeat of the gospel. God is showing up and he is present to us. That's the way I would say what Randy said last night, God's yes. God is showing up. He's with us. So in this, he is developing a way of framing and thinking about what it means to be church, and we need to hear that because we're wrestling with what it means to be church. One of the reasons why I want to work with Matthew and talk just a little bit about a section of Matthew is that part of our challenge is that we're a part of a culture that the shell of which has dropped away and we're left kind of standing. Now, this is not my idea. It's Jürgen Moltmann's idea, a German theologian. He says the problem with church is that for so many hundreds of years, the church has defined itself as a part of Christendom. And as a part of Christendom, the church's task was to serve as the chaplain to the institution of church and state that's all bound up together. But when Christendom fell away, which it's been falling away for some time now, the church has lost its sense of identity because it's drawn its identity from Christendom. So we don't know what it means to be church anymore. No longer is it our job simply to be a place for people to gather and worship God. We've got to define ourselves in some new ways. And I want to use Matthew to help us do a little bit of that today. Now, here's what you'll find some of these. Oh, I can bring these slides up myself, can't I? Yeah. So in Matthew 4:23, there's an interesting statement. It's a summary statement. And it reads, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and sickness. And his fame spread out throughout all of Syria, which, by the way, is kind of strange. We don't really know that Jesus did ministry in Syria, but Matthew thinks he did ministry in Syria, which is another reason why many people think that Matthew's in Syria writing this. What's interesting is that if you drift down to chapter 9, verse 35, you see that Matthew says, and Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in the synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and sickness. Those two look a lot alike, don't they? Do you notice this? Matthew has either got early onset of dementia and he's forgot he's told us this, or he's doing it intentionally, right? And I'm going to vote for he's doing it intentionally. In fact, I think what he's doing is doing what you learned in speech class. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. And what he's telling us is encapsulated in three participial phrases. Did you catch them? What were the three things that Jesus did? He was teaching, he was announcing, proclaiming, and he was healing. Now, what's interesting to me is that when you begin to walk through the Gospel of Matthew then, starting in chapters 5, 6, and 7, what in the world do we have Matthew giving us? Oh yeah, the Sermon on the Mount, that little bit of Jesus teaching. It's as if Matthew says, here is what is at the heartbeat of Jesus' teaching, the way in which he was seeking to form communities of people, disciples, the Sermon on the Mount. This is what it is. This is what it's like. This is what the embodiment of that is. And Matthew is offering that to his people, saying, this is what we're seeking to become. We're seeking to embody the teaching of Jesus. This teaching is not about intellectual content. It's not about acquiring a degree. It's about forming a kind of character, a kind of person who is a Jesus person, a disciple of Jesus. Then in chapter 8, I'm moving very quickly with this. I say moving quickly. Okay. He moves then in chapter 8, doing the systematic teacher kind of thing of giving us 5 stories that help us understand what it means for Jesus to announce that God is showing up and where God is showing up, to help us understand the nature of the kingdom that Jesus came announcing. In chapter 8, verse 1, we have the story of the leper who is healed by Jesus. Where does God show up? He shows up out at the fringes. Chapter 8, verse 5 is the story of the Centurion who has a servant who needs healing. And the great faith of this Centurion is disclosed. And then we have 8:14, where we have the story of Peter's mother-in-law. And she finds healing as well. And with these stories, Matthew is helping us get a sense of the ways in which God is showing up. He's showing up at the very fringes of the world that we inhabit. If the leper and the centurion and Peter's mother-in-law were to try to go to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, how far would they get? Well, the leper wouldn't get very far at all. And the centurion, Peter's mother, wouldn't get all that far. They could get into the temple precincts, but only so far. Matthew is saying, look, the nature of the work of God, the breaking in of God into our world is going into the farthest reaches of our imagination in society. God is showing up in all kinds of places. The 4th story is a hopeful story for us, because this is a story about disciples who are in a boat, who instead of having great faith have little bitty faith. But God acts decisively there. And the good news here, frankly, folks, is that I'm glad to announce this. God shows up among us weak faith disciple folk too. That's good news, by the way. And then the 5th story is this power of the kingdom that shows itself not only in the natural world of storm and sea and wind and water, but it's also the presence of God and the inbreaking of God, even to the supernatural and inexplicable places of life. All right? So these 5 stories are helping us understand that Jesus is coming. He's announcing and proclaiming that God is showing up. He is present to us. Then in chapter 9, guess how many stories are in chapter 9? Anybody want to guess? 5. And these 5 stories help us. Well, you've got that in front of you. I'm not going to worry about these texts. You've got them in front of you. Chapter 9, you have these stories. There's 5 of them that help us understand the nature of what it is when we talk about the healing work of Jesus, of making things whole. The first of those stories is about a paralytic who's healed from sin. That Jesus heals us from the power and brokenness of sin. Right? The paralytic let down through the ceiling. And this is one of those places where we see what Matthew's doing. If you want to preach or teach the story of the paralytic, you don't use the Gospel of Matthew. If I had a preaching student who wanted to do this and use Matthew, I'd give him an F. You do this from the Gospel of Mark, not from here, but because Matthew is collapsing the story to just simply make this quick little point. And then the next story is in verse 9, where we have Jesus showing up at a dinner party with folks who are publicans and sinners, and we find ourselves being confronted that Jesus comes to heal us from the separation between peoples and classes of people. The third story is in 9:14, where we see that Jesus heals us from scruples and the ways in which we want to get in fussy little fights about silly little things, about whether you can fast or not fast. Done with that. No more. The 4th story is this wonderful sandwich story of between the synagogue's daughter who dies and the woman who's hemorrhaging after 12 years, dealing with a hemorrhage for 12 years. And Matthew is announcing to us that Jesus heals us from sickness and responds to even the reality of death itself. So we've got Jesus healing us from sin, from separation, from scruples and fusses and fights, from sickness and death. And then the fifth pair of stories fall near the end of the chapter of chapter 9, where we have a little different turn that takes place with this healing. It's two blind men who are now able to see, and there's deaf mute who's able to speak. And it's as if Matthew is saying, not only does Jesus free us from stuff, he frees us to be able to see and to hear and to speak. Then in 9:35, Matthew says, hey, Jesus went about doing these things. Now, I've gone through this exercise this morning with you to make this very simple point. And that is that for this early ministerial leader, who also happens to be a name of Matthew, who also happens to be in our Holy Bible, that when he was thinking about what it means to do church, he was saying to his congregation, I think this is what it means to do church. Are you following me? And the questions I think we need to ask ourselves are we forming people of faith, disciples that approximate and or embody what we see in something like the Sermon on the Mount? Is that happening among us? Secondly, is our life and our witness demonstrating that God is showing up in our world? Are we announcing, are we proclaiming that God is present? And I'm not talking about Sunday morning sermons, though Sunday morning sermons ought to declare that, right? But does our ministry, does our life, does our practices, do our worship, do our ministries declare that, hey, God is present in our world? And thirdly, are we as a community of people demonstrating the therapeutic work of God? Healing. We're not the ones who necessarily do this. We are agents who declare it. But are we practicing shalom in our communities and places? I think that's the question our brother Matthew would ask us today. And I'm suggesting that you might find it an interesting sort of exercise to ask, how are we attending to this in my shop, in our place? How are we doing that? Now, some of you, and Renee, can you advance those for me, these slides, and bring us up to something that says table conversations. Yeah, churches practices formation of mature disciples, announcing the kingdom, announcing shalom. There you go. I'd like for you to just take a few moments at your table then to this next slide of table conversation. Which of these three practices are most clearly evidenced in your congregation? What barriers might exist in your place? How might your congregation's communal life be adapted to see these practices flourish? I'd like for you to take just a few minutes to work with that, and then I'll make another turn in the Gospel of Matthew.